July 1943. The skies over Western Europe are thick with tension. The war has stretched across continents, and the Allied forces, fresh from the successful invasion of North Africa, are now gearing up for their next major campaign, targeting Germany's heartland. Above the continent, the hum of German fighters echoes through the air, as Luftwaffe pilots, seasoned by years of combat, patrol their territory with unwavering confidence. Their mission? To keep the skies clear of Allied bombers, to protect their military bases, and to maintain the dominance the Luftwaffe once held. But as the sun rises over German airfields, a new, unfamiliar sound grows louder. The ground shakes as something powerful approaches. A new kind of aircraft, one that had never been encountered before by the German pilots, is on the horizon, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Initially, they are dismissive. This is just another Allied fighter, right? But as the roar of the Thunderbolt's engines cuts through the sky, the reality sets in. This aircraft is different. It is faster, more powerful, and carries an unrelenting strength that catches the German pilots off guard. The German pilots, who once commanded the skies with their nimble fighters, are stunned as the P-47s dive down on their airfields with precision. The Thunderbolts are not here to simply engage in dogfights. They are coming for their very bases. The German pilots, experienced and trained to handle aerial combat, now find themselves fighting a battle they weren't prepared for. These Thunderbolts, built for endurance and destruction, are on a mission to crush the heart of Germany's air defense, its own bases. The thunderous assault of the P-47s leaves the German pilots in shock. The mighty Luftwaffe, long a symbol of Germany's air superiority, is now facing an adversary unlike any it had encountered before. By the summer of 1943, the tide of war in Europe had begun to shift. The German forces, which had once dominated the skies with their formidable Luftwaffe, were now starting to feel the pressure from the increasingly powerful Allied air forces. The Luftwaffe, established as the aerial spearhead of Nazi Germany, had been the backbone of the Third Reich's military strategy. Early in the war, German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 had struck terror in the hearts of Allied pilots, achieving air superiority in most theaters of operation. But as the war dragged on and the Allies adapted, the Luftwaffe's dominance began to erode. The turning point came with the massive Allied air campaigns aimed at crippling German industry, infrastructure, and military capabilities. In 1943, the Allies launched a sustained bombing campaign against German cities and industrial centers with the aim of weakening the German war machine. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin from defending the Reich against constant air raids, was unable to effectively counter the growing wave of Allied bombers. The Allies were not just coming for the cities, they were coming for the very lifeblood of Germany's military power, its airfields. Enter the P-47 Thunderbolt. Introduced in 1941 and initially underutilized in favor of other fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the Thunderbolt soon proved to be a force to be reckoned with. Designed by Republic Aviation, the P-47 was a heavy-hitting, robust fighter built for long-range bomber escorts and ground attack missions. Its powerful Pratt & Whitney radial engine and thick armor made it exceptionally durable, able to withstand hits that would have crippled other aircraft. Unlike the nimble and agile fighters that had dominated earlier battles, the P-47 was a true war machine, capable of carrying heavy bomb loads and engaging in ground strikes while also participating in high-intensity dogfights. Its sheer firepower, with 8 50-caliber machine guns, made it a devastating threat to both enemy aircraft and ground targets. In the summer of 1943, the P-47s were brought into the fight in full force. The United States Army Air Force, USAAF, began using the Thunderbolts to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, ensuring that the heavy bombers could reach their targets without being destroyed by enemy fighters. The Thunderbolts' ability to stay with the bombers for long distances, providing cover and protection, was a game-changer. But the true shock for the German pilots came when they realized that the Thunderbolts were not only escorting bombers, they were also attacking German air bases directly. Though, strategic shift in Allied air tactics was not just about bombing factories or military installations. It was about destroying the very heart of the Luftwaffe. The Germans had long relied on their airfields to supply their fighters and keep the skies protected. But now, with the P-47 Thunderbolts capable of flying long-range missions and delivering devastating ground attacks, the Allies were taking the fight directly to these crucial air bases. The Thunderbolts, with their rugged design and long-range capabilities, began to pound German airfields in ways that no German pilot had expected. The Zeros of the Luftwaffe, once symbols of air superiority, were now facing a new kind of threat, one that would leave them reeling in shock. At the time, German pilots still believed their Luftwaffe was the dominant force in the sky, but the Thunderbolts' capabilities made that belief increasingly untenable. While German pilots were trained for nimble dogfights, the P-47 was a plane that could outlast them, overpower them, and destroy their bases. The shift in momentum was clear. The Luftwaffe's dominance was coming to an end. For the German military leadership, this change in aerial warfare tactics was a devastating blow. The American air raids, especially against German airfields, were not just attacks on physical infrastructure, but strikes at the heart of the Luftwaffe's ability to wage war. Each successful raid meant fewer fighters in the air, less ability to defend their homeland, and a shrinking window of opportunity to reverse the war's course. For the experienced German pilots of the Luftwaffe, the summer of 1943 marked a shocking and jarring reality. Throughout the early years of World War II, the Luftwaffe had been synonymous with air superiority. Their planes were faster, more agile, and equipped with advanced technology. Pilots like Erich Hartmann, known as the Blonde Knight of Germany, had racked up impressive kill counts and became national heroes. But by 1943, the reality of war had changed. The German pilots were no longer facing the same overmatched Allied forces they had encountered in the earlier stages of the conflict. Instead, they now faced an enemy that had adapted, evolved, and found ways to counter the once dominant Luftwaffe. The introduction of the American P-47 Thunderbolt was the first sign that the skies above Europe would no longer belong to the Germans. The Thunderbolt, with its immense firepower and rugged design, was a plane unlike any the Luftwaffe pilots had encountered before. While the Zeros had once been the terror of the Pacific skies, the P-47 quickly became the terror of the European sky. The shock for the German pilots was multifaceted. Not only were they facing a fighter that was faster and more powerful than many of the planes they had previously engaged, but they also had to contend with a new kind of strategy. The American planes were no longer just providing escort to bombers. They were coming after the airfields directly. German pilots who had been trained to fight over the skies of occupied Europe, defending their land from American and British bombers, were now having to fight on a different front. The very foundations of their air defense, their bases, were being attacked with unprecedented intensity by the P-47s. The emotional impact was profound. For many of the Luftwaffe pilots, who had once flown with the confidence of being at the peak of military aviation, this was a bitter pill to swallow. Their planes, once considered among the finest in the world, were now being outclassed. As the Thunderbolts unleashed their devastating ground attacks, striking their air bases and military infrastructure, German pilots were left not only fighting the war in the air, but also confronting their own growing sense of helplessness. In many ways, this experience was demoralizing for the Luftwaffe pilots. The psychological toll of seeing their airfields destroyed, their comrades killed, and their machines rendered useless by the relentless American assault was overwhelming. They had been taught that their superior training, aircraft, and tactics would lead to victory. But now, Those very same qualities were failing them against an enemy that had learned and adapted far faster than they had anticipated. For some pilots, this realization was crippling. The mounting losses, both in terms of aircraft and skilled pilots, created an environment of growing despair. These were seasoned professionals who had once been able to outmaneuver their foes with ease. Now, they were no longer in control of the skies. The psychological shift in their thinking was not just about facing a more formidable enemy, but about confronting their own diminishing ability to fight a war that had been rapidly evolving beyond their grasp. The P-47 Thunderbolt, designed by Republic Aviation, was an aircraft built with one purpose in mind: to dominate the skies and crush enemy defenses. The aircraft was not as nimble as some of its contemporaries, like the German Bf-109 or FW-190, but what it lacked in agility, it made up for in sheer firepower and durability. The Thunderbolt was a heavy, robust fighter equipped with 8 50-caliber machine guns, which made it capable of taking on both enemy aircraft and ground targets with devastating effectiveness. The introduction of the P-47 into the European theater represented a tactical shift in how the United States fought its air campaigns. The Thunderbolt's primary mission was to provide bomber escorts deep into enemy territory. But, as its capabilities became evident, it quickly transformed into a versatile weapon capable of more than just protecting bombers. With its rugged construction, the P-47 could take more damage than other aircraft and continue flying, giving it an edge in long-range missions. Its ability to sustain battle damage and return to base made it a reliable tool in the hands of skilled American pilots. The P-47's true strategic superiority, however, lay in its ability to target and destroy German airfields. Unlike other aircraft, which focused primarily on engaging in dogfights or bombing runs, the P-47 was equipped to attack the very infrastructure that the Luftwaffe depended on. American pilots, with their long-range capabilities, were able to carry out ground strikes that targeted German air bases, supply lines, and aircraft hangars. The P-47's size, firepower, and resilience made it ideal for these types of missions, allowing the Americans to cripple the German Air Force's ability to operate effectively. The Thunderbolt's ability to launch attacks on airfields was a key element in the shift in momentum in the war. Previously, the German military had relied on their airfields as vital command and control hubs. But with the P-47s now pounding these airbases, the Germans found themselves unable to mount a coherent defense. The destruction of airfields meant fewer fighters available for defense, and the subsequent disruption of German military operations contributed to the gradual erosion of the Luftwaffe's strength. The strategic impact of the P-47's bombing raids on airbases could not be understated. These attacks undermined the very foundation of the German air war effort. For the American pilots, the P-47 Thunderbolt became an indispensable tool in securing air superiority. As they took to the skies to challenge the Luftwaffe's once dominant force, they realized that their success depended on more than just aerial combat. Destroying the enemy's capacity to fight was just as critical as defeating them in the air. By attacking German airfields, the Americans not only weakened the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, but also crippled the Germans' ability to respond to Allied bombers, accelerating their dominance in the skies. The success of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe can be attributed not only to the aircraft's impressive design, but also to the strategic vision of U.S. military leadership. The shift in American air strategy during World War II marked a significant evolution from defensive tactics to a more aggressive approach aimed at crippling the enemy's infrastructure and resources. This transition, which played a pivotal role in the success of the Allied forces in Europe, was led by American commanders who understood the importance of air superiority and the need to disrupt the enemy's ability to wage war on multiple fronts. In particular, the leadership of General H. Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the guidance of commanders such as General Curtis LeMay were integral in the implementation of a strategy focused on long-range bombing and fighter escorts. The realization that attacking airfields and industrial hubs would be just as crucial as engaging in dogfights with enemy fighters was a major turning point in U.S. air tactics. Under their leadership, the American forces recognized that the key to breaking the backbone of the Luftwaffe was not just engaging the German fighters head-on, but targeting the very heart of their operations, the airfields where they launched and maintained their aerial campaigns. The P-47 Thunderbolt, as part of this evolving strategy, became a cornerstone of American success. Its ability to perform dual roles, escort and ground attack, made it invaluable in achieving the Allies' strategic goals. The leadership of the U.S. Air Force ensured that American pilots were trained to use the Thunderbolt's power effectively, enabling them to strike not just at German planes, but at the infrastructure that sustained them. This strategic shift marked a decisive moment in the air war in Europe. As it allowed the Americans to maintain control over the skies while simultaneously weakening the German ability to respond to attacks. The decision to prioritize the destruction of airfields, while risky, proved highly effective. It showed that leadership, both on the ground and in the skies, was key to achieving sustained air superiority. This approach demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability of U.S. military leaders, who understood that, in a war defined by technological innovation, the ability to change tactics quickly was essential for victory. The emotional impact of the P-47 Thunderbolts on the German pilots was profound, but it also affected the American soldiers who piloted these powerful aircraft. As the war drew to its final stages, the American pilots, who had been trained to view the Germans as the enemy, began to confront the complex reality of the war's aftermath. The brutal reality of warfare had defined their missions. Each flight, each raid, was about victory at any cost. But as the Allies moved closer to Germany, they began to consider the emotional and moral dimensions of their campaign. The act of pounding German airbases and military installations was not just a strategic objective, it was a brutal acknowledgement of the destruction and the human cost of war. The American pilots knew that every bomb dropped and every strike on a base brought the war one step closer to its conclusion. Yet, they also understood that their victories in the air had devastating consequences for the people they had once seen as enemies. The moral complexity of this realization did not go unnoticed. Many of the American pilots had joined the military to fight for freedom and to defeat a regime that had committed atrocities on an unimaginable scale. Yet, as the war neared its end and the faces of their defeated adversaries grew clearer, some pilots began to wonder about the cost of their success. The act of targeting airfields, while essential for securing victory, was also a reminder that the men they were fighting were just that. Men, not faceless enemies. These men had families, homes, and lives outside of the war. In this moment, the humanity of both sides began to emerge. For the German pilots, the shock of being bombed and forced to fight against superior American air power was difficult to process. They had been trained to defend their country, to believe in the might of the Luftwaffe, and to maintain the faith that their victory was inevitable. The sudden realization that their warplanes, their strategies, and their morale were no match for the evolving Allied tactics was devastating. The damage to their airfields was more than just a strategic loss. It was a psychological blow that shook their confidence. They were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. As American Thunderbolts tore through the skies, destroying their most vital military installations. For the German pilots who survived these encounters, the psychological toll was immense. The once proud Luftwaffe had become a shadow of its former self. They knew that the war was lost, and that their efforts to defend Germany's airspace had been in vain. The P-47 Thunderbolts, relentless in their assault on German air bases, had symbolized not just the technological superiority of the Americans, but also the inevitability of their victory. The moral dimension of war, the recognition that both sides were made up of human beings rather than faceless forces, would become more apparent in the aftermath of the war. For the American pilots, the realization that their actions had led to the destruction of an entire air force and the defeat of an enemy would be met with mixed emotions. While their victory was something to be proud of, they would carry the weight of the moral complexities of war for the rest of their lives. As the war raged into 1943, the skies above Europe were filled with the sounds of battle, and the Allies' strategic bombings were taking their toll on the German war machine. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force in the skies, was beginning to show cracks. For years, the German pilots had reigned supreme in aerial combat, securing the airspace over Europe and wreaking havoc on Allied bombers. However, by the summer of 1943, the tables were beginning to turn. The Allies had adapted, developed more advanced technologies, and had the element of surprise on their side. The turning point came during a series of long-range bombing raids over Germany, which saw the American P-47 Thunderbolts taking on a more aggressive role than simply escorting bombers. The P-47s, designed for endurance and heavy ground attack, had long been in the American arsenal, but their true potential had yet to be fully realized. The Thunderbolts, with their immense firepower, thick armor, and rugged durability, were ideal for more than just bomber protection. They could now strike directly at the heart of the German air defenses, the air bases. On July 25, 1943, during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, American fighters launched the first major assault on German airfields using P-47 Thunderbolts. The Germans had expected the Americans to follow their usual tactics, engaging in dogfights or bomber escorts. What they didn't anticipate was a direct assault on their bases. The P-47s, with their ability to endure long-range missions and still carry out devastating attacks, started pounding the very airfields that had once been the pride of the Luftwaffe. The bombings were swift and deadly. German aircraft parked on the ground. Fuel supplies, hangars, and radar stations were all targeted, crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to respond to Allied bombers or fighters. The German pilots, many of whom had been trained to expect engagement in the air, were stunned. They had learned how to engage in aerial combat, to defend their skies, but they had never prepared for an enemy capable of attacking them where they were most vulnerable, on the ground. The P-47 Thunderbolts were no longer just a tool for air superiority. They were weapons that struck with precision, directly hitting the heart of German aviation. As the P-47s pounded the airfields, the German pilots watched helplessly as their aircraft, many of which had already been damaged in previous skirmishes, were destroyed in waves. The emotional and tactical impact of the bombing raids was staggering. For the German pilots, the skies they had once ruled with confidence now felt different. The unmistakable sound of American Thunderbolts, their engines a deep roar that cut through the air, left them with a sense of dread that would only grow stronger in the following months. The turning point in the war was not just the destruction of aircraft and airfields. It was the collapse of the German pilots' sense of invincibility. The Zeros and Messerschmitts that had once been symbols of German dominance were now facing a new kind of adversary, one that was not only more advanced, but able to take the fight directly to the source of German power. It was a fight the Luftwaffe had not anticipated, and it would prove to be the beginning of the end of their control over European skies. As the P-47 Thunderbolts continued their relentless assaults on the German airfields, the psychological impact on the Luftwaffe pilots deepened. The once proud dominance of the German fighter aircraft was crumbling. For the German pilots who had grown accustomed to controlling the skies, the loss of their airfields was not just a tactical setback. It was a profound blow to their confidence and morale. The Zeros and Messerschmitts that had once been their pride were now proving vulnerable, not only in dogfights, but also in a new form of warfare, one that attacked them where they could not fight back. The P-47's ability to strike deep into German territory and damage air bases directly was a game-changer. Previously, the Luftwaffe's airfields had been protected by layers of defense and the skill of the pilots who flew them. The Germans had always assumed that their airfields, where they housed the lifeblood of their air power, were untouchable. But the Thunderbolts' ability to evade German fighters, absorb damage, and still strike with devastating force shattered this assumption. It was not just a matter of combat prowess. It was a stark demonstration of the evolving nature of warfare. The Germans had become accustomed to defending their territory from the skies, but now, their most vulnerable points were exposed to direct attack by an adversary they had underestimated. The Luftwaffe's immediate response to the American Thunderbolts was to scramble as many fighters as possible into the air to engage the incoming threat. However, this only exacerbated their problem. As more German planes took off to intercept the American attackers, they left their airfields even more exposed. The Thunderbolts, working in coordination with other American bombers and fighters, targeted the German planes on the ground. The result was devastating. Aircraft destroyed, runways cratered, and hangars left in smoldering ruins. The Germans were losing their ability to defend the very infrastructure that had allowed them to dominate the skies for years. The turning point, however, went beyond just the loss of equipment. The damage to German morale was tangible. Pilots who had once seen themselves as invincible in their Zeros and Messerschmitts now faced an adversary they could not defeat in a traditional dogfight. The P-47 Thunderbolts, with their overwhelming firepower and durability, had not only outclassed the German fighters in direct engagement, but had also proven that the Americans could reach them at their most vulnerable point, on the ground. As the Germans lost their air superiority, they found themselves on the defensive in a war they had previously believed they could win. The P-47s, with their rugged design and overwhelming firepower, now dominated the skies, forcing the German Luftwaffe into a position where they could no longer dictate the terms of battle. The sudden realization that their airfields and bases, once considered secure and invulnerable, were now fair game for American planes, had a lasting impact. German pilots, who had once taken pride in their superiority, were now forced to defend their homeland in a way they had not anticipated. This moment, when the P-47 Thunderbolts tore through the German defenses, was not just a tactical shift, but a psychological one as well. The Germans, once the unquestioned masters of aerial combat, were now losing their grip on the skies. The Thunderbolts' ability to absorb damage and keep fighting, to deliver crushing blows against the Luftwaffe's airfields, and to remain a constant presence in the skies, marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. The balance of power had decisively shifted. What had once been a war fought on the edge of the skies was now one where the American forces were capable of striking deep into the heart of Germany's air defenses. For the German pilots, the full scope of their predicament was only beginning to set in. They had been trained to see themselves as superior to their enemies, to view the skies as their domain. But, with the relentless assault of the P-47 Thunderbolts on their airfields, the German pilots could no longer deny the changing face of aerial combat. The shock of facing an adversary who could hit them where it hurt most, their air bases, was a turning point in the war. It was a stark reminder that in modern warfare, even the most formidable air forces could be undone by strategic innovation and technological superiority. The aftermath of the Allied air assault in 1943, particularly the destruction caused by the P-47 Thunderbolts against the Luftwaffe's airfields, reverberated far beyond the immediate tactical impact. As the Allied forces began to dominate the skies, the psychological toll on the Luftwaffe pilots was immense. The realization that their airfields, once the unassailable backbone of their defense, were vulnerable to destruction was not just a loss of equipment, but a devastating blow to German morale. The loss of these critical infrastructure points disrupted the German ability to rapidly deploy new fighters. rearm their aircraft, and mount effective counterattacks. For the German High Command, the attack on airfields marked a significant turning point in the war. Germany's ability to maintain air superiority had been a cornerstone of its military strategy. With the loss of air bases, the Luftwaffe's capacity to defend its territories was compromised. The inability to launch effective countermeasures against the advancing American fighters and bombers signaled that the tide of the war was turning in favor of the Allies. German pilots, many of whom had been trained to engage in dogfights and defend their airspace, were now forced to adapt to an entirely new form of warfare. No longer could they rely solely on aerial combat skills to protect their country. The devastating attacks on their airfields made it clear that the war was not just being fought in the skies, it was being fought on the ground as well. The Allies were systematically eroding the very infrastructure that the Luftwaffe had relied upon to maintain air superiority. This shift from traditional dogfighting to the strategic targeting of key infrastructure would have long-lasting consequences for the German war effort. The impact of these attacks was felt in the air as well. With fewer operational aircraft and limited fuel supplies, the German pilots found themselves outmatched. The P-47 Thunderbolts, with their long-range capabilities, could now strike deep into German territory, bypassing the defenses the Luftwaffe had once relied on to protect their airspace. The attacks on airfields forced the Germans to stretch their resources even thinner, as they scrambled to repair runways, rebuild aircraft, and recover from mounting losses. The psychological and tactical effects of these airfield strikes were compounded by the realization that the Luftwaffe could no longer count on its superior numbers or equipment. Pilots who had once believed in the invincibility of their aircraft and the superiority of their tactics now found themselves fighting a war on two fronts: in the air, where they were increasingly outclassed, and on the ground, where their airfields were being systematically destroyed. This dual pressure wore down the morale of the German pilots, who, despite their skill and experience, were being overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the Allied air offensive. In the broader scope of the war, the attacks on German airfields also signified the failure of Nazi Germany's military leadership to adapt to the evolving dynamics of modern warfare. While the Luftwaffe had initially been a powerful tool in the German arsenal, its inability to adjust to the increasing power of Allied aviation marked the beginning of its decline. The failure to develop new tactics, the underestimation of American technological advancements, and the constant strain on German resources left the Luftwaffe ill-prepared to face the onslaught from the Allies. The American pilots, who had once fought a defensive battle to protect their bombers, were now on the offensive, and their strikes on German airfields became a defining feature of the Allies' superiority in the air. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its ability to carry out long-range missions and deliver devastating blows to the enemy on the ground, was proving to be one of the most effective tools in the war. The aircraft's sheer resilience and firepower allowed it to deliver punishing strikes on German targets, weakening the Luftwaffe's ability to mount a defense. For the United States, the aftermath of this shift in air power represented a major turning point in the war. The ability to maintain air superiority even over enemy territory meant that the Allies could now attack the very core of Germany's military capabilities. The destruction of the Luftwaffe's airfields was not just a tactical victory, it was a psychological one, signaling the collapse of German resistance in the skies. As the battle raged on, and the Allies continued their relentless strikes, the consequences of the German defeat in the skies became increasingly evident. The Luftwaffe's once mighty airfields, which had served as the nerve centers of Nazi Germany's air defense, lay in ruins. The strategic strikes on these bases had crippled the German Air Force, leaving them unable to mount a sufficient defense against the growing power of the American and Allied forces. The American success in destroying key airfields had far-reaching effects on Germany's war capabilities. Not only were their planes destroyed, but their ability to produce and maintain them was significantly reduced. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin due to heavy losses in previous battles, found it increasingly difficult to replace aircraft or keep up with the technological advances being made by the Allies. The P-47 Thunderbolts, with their endurance and destructive power, were a major part of this transformation. As they flew deeper into German territory and struck at the heart of the Luftwaffe's infrastructure, they left a lasting scar on Germany's war effort. For the German High Command, the loss of airfields was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow to the entire Nazi war effort. The Luftwaffe had once been one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, but now it was being rendered ineffective against an enemy that had adapted, evolved, and capitalized on its technological superiority. The realization that their once feared air force could no longer defend the airspace above Germany itself was a stark reminder that the war was slipping away from them. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the skies, was now a shadow of its former self, unable to fend off the relentless Allied onslaught. This loss also had a profound effect on the morale of the German civilian population. The air raids on German cities had already taken a heavy toll on civilian life, but the destruction of airfields, symbols of Nazi power, was a blow to the Nazi regime's propaganda machine. As the Allies targeted these vital military installations, it became clear to the German people that their government could no longer protect them. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of national pride and strength, was now a symbol of failure. The psychological impact of these attacks on the German population was immense. It signaled that the war was all but lost, and that Germany's defeat was now inevitable. For the American forces, the aftermath of the destruction of German airfields marked a critical shift in the war. With the Luftwaffe no longer able to mount a sufficient defense, the Allies were free to conduct air raids on Germany's industrial centers and infrastructure with impunity. The P-47 Thunderbolts, which had proven so effective in these ground strikes, were instrumental in disrupting Germany's war economy. Factories that had once produced weapons and aircraft for the Luftwaffe were now prime targets for American bombers, and with air superiority secured, the Allies could strike at the heart of Germany's war machine. The long-term impact of these victories in the air was not just military, but also strategic. The Allies now had the ability to launch air raids deep into Germany's heartland, weakening the country's ability to fight on multiple fronts. With air superiority firmly in the hands of the U.S. and Allied forces, Germany's capacity for retaliation was severely limited. The destruction of the Luftwaffe, coupled with the relentless pressure from American and British bombers, left Germany's military in a position where they could no longer defend their homeland effectively. For the German military leadership, the aftermath was filled with bitter recognition of their failing strategy. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect the airspace and airfields had made it impossible for them to maintain their previous dominance. The lack of technological innovation, the failure to replace lost aircraft, and the mounting pressure from Allied forces all contributed to the collapse of the German air defense system. The consequences of their failure to adapt to the changing nature of warfare were now apparent. They were no longer in control of the skies. For the American forces, the aftermath was one of triumph. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven itself as a versatile and powerful weapon in their arsenal, capable of taking on both enemy aircraft and strategic ground targets. The Thunderbolt's ability to strike at the very heart of the Luftwaffe's defenses, its airfields, was a key factor in the destruction of German air power. The success of the P-47, combined with improved tactics and coordination, marked the shift in the balance of power over Europe's skies. The Allies now held air superiority, and this was a decisive factor in the final phases of the war. As the war drew to a close, the psychological and military impact of the P-47 Thunderbolt's success in dismantling the German airfields remained a defining moment in the Allied victory. The German Luftwaffe, once a symbol of Nazi power, had been shattered. The resilience and firepower of the P-47s had crippled their airfields, destroyed their planes, and ultimately broken their spirit. The skies of Europe were now firmly under Allied control, and the road to victory was clear. The destruction of the German airfields by the P-47 Thunderbolts in 1943 was a moment that would change the course of the war, not just in tactical terms, but in the very psychology of the conflict. For the Allies, it marked the moment when the skies over Europe, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, were finally within their control. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its unparalleled firepower, endurance, and resilience, had proven that it was not just a tool of combat, but a force capable of reshaping the balance of power in a single, decisive move. The German pilots, once so confident in their air superiority, were left in shock. Their airfields, the very lifeblood of their operations, had been rendered vulnerable by an enemy they had not fully understood. The P-47, though not the most nimble or agile, was a true testament to the power of innovation. It was a machine designed not just to defeat the enemy in aerial combat, but to strike at the heart of their military infrastructure. As German airfields lay in ruins, so too did the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. For the German military leadership, this loss marked the unraveling of their aerial dominance, a turning point from which they would never recover. For the American forces, the success of the P-47 was a symbol of their growing air superiority and the shifting tides of the war. The relentless bombardment of German airfields disrupted the Luftwaffe's ability to defend their homeland and crippled their capacity for retaliation. The Thunderbolts' versatility, able to escort bombers, engage in dogfights, and strike critical ground targets, made it an indispensable tool in the Allies' arsenal. It demonstrated the power of American ingenuity and the ability to adapt to new forms of warfare. The P-47's success was a clear signal that the U.S. had not only the technological edge but the strategic foresight to win the war. But the true significance of the Thunderbolt's role in the destruction of German air power extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. The P-47 represented the broader strategic approach that would define the Allied victory in Europe. It was no longer enough to simply engage the enemy in combat. The new warfare required targeting the very infrastructure that sustained them. The destruction of airfields was a direct strike at the heart of the Luftwaffe's operations, cutting off their ability to sustain their aerial defenses. This shift in tactics, from fighting on the front lines to striking at the base of their opponent's power, was crucial in dismantling the Axis forces. The war, as it progressed into 1944 and 1945, was no longer a fight for territorial control. It was a war of attrition. The success of the P-47 Thunderbolt in damaging German airfields and disrupting their war machine was an embodiment of the relentless Allied pursuit of victory. It marked a clear shift from the early years of the war, when the Luftwaffe had the upper hand, to a new phase in which the Allies, with their superior technology, strategy, and coordination, were firmly in control. The consequences of these victories in the skies were not just military. The morale of the German military and the civilian population began to erode. The loss of air superiority had a ripple effect that affected the very core of Nazi propaganda, which had long used the Luftwaffe's power as a symbol of the invincibility of the Third Reich. The devastating strikes against German airfields, coupled with the growing realization that their air forces could no longer defend their homeland, marked the psychological breaking point for many Germans. It signaled to them that the war was drawing to a close, and with it, the realization that defeat was imminent. For the Allied forces, the victory in the skies over Europe marked a pivotal moment in the broader scope of the war. It was not just about the defeat of German aircraft. It was the symbolic collapse of the Axis power in the air. The P-47 Thunderbolts, and the men who flew them, were emblematic of the shifting tides of war. From the relentless suffering of the early years to the ultimate triumph of technology, strategy, and courage. The war in Europe was coming to an end, but the lessons learned from the skies over Germany would continue to shape military tactics and aviation technology for decades to come. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt in World War II is not just one of technological superiority, but of the power of innovation in the face of adversity. It was a symbol of the ability to adapt, to shift tactics, and to overcome the seemingly insurmountable challenges of war. The Thunderbolt's victory over the Luftwaffe was not just the triumph of a machine, it was the triumph of the human spirit, which had adapted to the changing demands of modern warfare and ultimately led the Allies to victory.